We will start. So what I'm going to talk about over the, I guess, the next couple of lectures is this thing called the McDonald eta function identities. But I want to start sort of by placing this in, more or less its historical context and so on. So I'm sort of going to ramble for a little while about some of the things which preceded the discovery of these identities and sort of what role they play and so on. So the what the eta function is something I'll probably say towards the end, but let's start out with what types of identities one is interested in and where all the action is taking place. So these identities are identities which connect formal power series, okay, or power series. So let's just, so these are identities concerning power series in one variable. So what is a power series? So the ring of power series with complex coefficients is denoted like this, and the variable is historically called Q. So it's a power series in the variable Q. And what is this? Well, these are just all infinite formal series for now of the form A0 plus A1Q plus A2Q square and so on, where all these coefficients are complex numbers, right. So that's what a power series in one variable is, and we will often think of these in one of two ways. So one can sort of get away with just thinking about these as formal power series most of the time. So what would a formal power series mean? You just think of it as a formal object. You define addition of two power series by saying that you just add the corresponding coefficients of powers of Q, and you multiply two of them by using the usual rule for multiplying polynomials, for example. You multiply them out and you collect the corresponding coefficients of powers of Q. Okay, so you could think of these as purely formal objects. So that's one point of view, or on the other hand, you could also sort of imagine plugging in values for Q. So if you want to think of Q as a complex number, so then of course we are in the realm of analysis. So you could think of these as analytic objects. So now of course you want to know when can you plug in a certain number for Q. It won't always make sense. So you have, you need to study convergence of these power series, and so the usual theory says when you have a power series, it always has a radius of convergence. You can find a number R, which is positive number 0 or greater than 0, such that for all modulus of Q less than R, this series converges absolutely. And it will turn out that in most series of interest, typically the radius of convergence will end up being 1. So remember, the theory analysis says you always have a radius of convergence of a power series, and inside that radius of convergence, so as long as Q is a complex number less than R, you can think of this as an honest function. So f of Q, which you define as this convergent, the value of this convergent series, this would end up being an analytic function in that disk. Okay, so this is an analytic function or holomorphic function in that disk. Like I said, often it will turn out that R is 1, so we are actually looking at a well-defined function inside the unit disk, and we'll also, again most of the time we'll really think of Q. So there's sort of a change of variable. We will think of we will often substitute Q as, so often you will see maybe always is also accurate. Sort of change variable to tau. Okay, so let's look at q as e to the 2 pi I tau. And so, for example, when say this series converges when q, I mean if the radius of convergence is 1, series converges in the unit disk and q lies in the unit disk. Correspondingly, it implies, if you think of it as a function of tau, then the series converges for, so think of f of tau. So, tau is now a complex number. So, if you define the series this way, so I am just plugging in q as e to the 2 pi I tau. Now, where would this converge, for example? Yeah? Suppose modulus of q less than 1 is where this series converges, but in terms of tau, what does that translate into? The what? The whole plane? The whole plane? All complex numbers? For example, if you plug in tau equals say minus I, then you are in trouble, right? So, it is the upper half plane. So, the imaginary part of tau must be positive, because the modulus is just e to the 2 pi times minus of the imaginary part of tau. So, this would converge. So, if say the radius of convergence of the original power series is 1, implies this series is now, so f of tau would end up being analytic on the upper half plane for say tau belonging to the upper half plane. Okay. So, this will be the typical situation. So, invariably the power series that we will construct, when you think of it in the analytic point of view, you will end up defining some nice analytic function on the upper half plane. But for now, I am just going to think of these using the first point of view. Let me just think of them as formal series. So, I will eventually start talking about these. And so, I sort of mentioned the word identities. So, the identities are between two types of power series. So, the typical type of identity, so here is a kind of power series identity. The form of the power series identity is always the following. It is a product equals a sum. Okay, it is a sum equals product kind of identity, where both these things are infinite. So, it is an infinite product on one side and an infinite sum on the other. Okay, so, this will typically be some infinite product, and on the other side, this will range over some infinite set again. So, some alpha ranging over some infinite set n. So, all these identities are of this form, okay, product equals sum. Okay, so let us start with the infinite products. So, I will just sort of mention a few examples of infinite products. So, I am going to talk about, so let us say section 2, we talk about some infinite products. And remember, I am now going to think of them as just formal power series. So, let me start with some examples of infinite products. Example 1, let's define this function of q. So, consider this infinite product of 1 minus q to the n, where n goes from 1 to infinity. Okay. So, we want to think of this as an infinite product. Now, what does it mean? I mean, what does an infinite product mean? So, if you are in this analysis perspective, one sort of knows what it means. You would take finite products, sort of the finite partial products, and then look for their convergence. That sequence of finite partial products must converge to some number. But on the other hand, if you are thinking of this as an infinite formal product, well, you sort of use the same definition. You look at these finite partial products. So, what does it mean to talk about this as an element of the power series ring? How is this an element of this power series ring? Well, you sort of use the usual idea. You look at these 1 through n of these guys. So, in fact, here it is just here it's just a polynomial, but it could also be a power series in general. So, look at this as a well, like I said, in this case a polynomial, and now as you let n grow larger and larger, you just look for the coefficients of. So, when you write this, so okay, maybe we should write this out properly. So, let us say this is now the sum. So, like I said, in general it could be a power series, some coefficients, what am I calling them, a, p, but these coefficients of course depend on n. You expand the partial. So, a finite product, we know how to make sense out of it, right. You just expand it out and you get some power series in general, and so of course you get some coefficients for the power series which will depend on n because we have fixed some n. And now you sort of let n increase, and if these things, if these coefficients stabilize, if they become constant for some large enough n, then you define that as the value of these guys. So, for example, so if a p n is the same, is equal to a p m for all n m large for every fixed p. So, you fix a p for every fixed p. If it turns out, I mean the stage from which this happens can change with p, but as long as they stabilize, you define that stable value as the sort of the stable coefficient. You then define sort of the stable value of the coefficient to be this constant, which we can sort of maybe even write like this. It's just sort of a silly way of writing it, but it's in fact a constant. You define that as a stable value, and you say, okay, I will think of my infinite product as just being just a series formed by these stable coefficients. Okay, so it's sort of the natural definition in some sense. And you will see that pretty much all the things in practice, these coefficients will become constant, as the powers of q or whatever else that appear will be. I guess it's probably even true for all power series. So anyway, so that's the definition of an infinite product. And the important thing here is that in many of these examples, these coefficients often have some nice combinatorial meaning. Okay, so let me sort of demonstrate that with a second example. Let me call this psi of q. Let me look at the infinite product 1 plus q to b. Okay. So, if you take the infinite product 1 plus q to the n going from 0 to infinity, and now you attempt to figure out what this gives, what are the coefficients in this infinite product expansion. So, let us call these okay. So, we want to figure out the coefficient of any power of q in this infinite product expansion. So, for example, let's just work this out. What would you find the coefficient of q to the 6 to be? Right. So, imagine you have 1 plus q squared, 1 plus q cubed, and so on. Right. So, in this infinite product, you are trying to multiply them all out and figure out how many ways you will get the term q to the 6. Okay. So, the first thing to note is you will only get q to the 6 in finitely many ways. Right. So, how would you get q to the 6? Well, it will appear in the following ways. There will be a term 1 plus q to the 6 somewhere. So, it will appear from there just as q to the 6. Right. There will be, for example, 1 plus, there will be a term 1 plus q to the 5 and a term 1 plus q to the 1. So, it will appear as q to the 1. So, here is one contribution. Another contribution is q to the 1 times q to the 5. Right. Let me write it as 5 times 1. Then there will be q to the 4 and a q to the 2 will also be a q to the 6. Right. Is that all? Is that all? Yeah. 3, 2, 1. right? There's q to the 3, 2, 1. So that will be another contribution. And that's it. You can't really get it in any other way. And if you sort of see what this really gives you, it gives you what's called a partition of 6. So we are doing the following, you are partitioning 6 in these ways, and corresponding each of these you get one term q to the 6, and these are the partitions of 6. For example, 3 plus 3 is also a partition of 6, right? But these are the partitions which involve distinct parts, where all the parts are distinct. So therefore, observe here that AP, this coefficient here, turns out to be the number of partitions of P into distinct parts. Okay. And so of course, one should have a similar thing here. So let's come back to this original function phi of q and ask, what do its coefficients compute? So phi of q, say n goes from 0 to infinity, an q to the n. It's the infinite product with 1 minus q to the n's in it. So now the question is, what is an here? So you just got to incorporate the negative signs somehow. So if you again imagine the same q to the 6 with minus signs here instead of pluses, then the q to the 6 term will come with a minus sign, right? The q to the 5, q to the 1, there will be 2 minuses, so it's a plus. Here there are 2 minuses, it's a plus. There are 3 minuses, so it's a minus, right? So you do get 0 as the final coefficient, because there are actually 4 terms, but 2 of them contribute a plus and 2 of them contribute a minus. So in fact, an in this case is the following. It's the number of partitions of n into distinct parts, that's still the same, but you have to look at the ones where with an even number of parts separately. So into distinct parts where number of parts is even, minus, so it's sort of a subtraction of these two things, minus the number of partitions into distinct parts where the number of parts is odd, right? So it just computes the difference between the number of parts, number of partitions into distinct parts where the number of parts is even minus those in which the number of parts is odd. For example, for 6 there were 2 partitions with an even number of parts, the 5 plus 1 and the 4 plus 2, and there were 2 with an odd number of parts, the 6 and the 3 to 1, and so their contributions cancelled in the end. But in general, here's the expression for an or phi q. Okay, and so we are sort of ready to state the very first of those identities of this kind, of the kind product equals sum, and this is the theorem of Euler, sort of stated I think sometime in the 1740. It's called the Euler's pentagonal number theorem, which says that this infinite product can actually be written as the following infinite sum. Now this is J belonging to all integers. So the sum ranges now over all the integers of, see, it's minus 1 to the j q to the j times 3j plus 1 over 2. Okay. So, here is the identity. And it's, so what it says really is that, you know, when you expand this infinite product out, those would be, so you only, the coefficients are either +1, -1 or 0, okay, for the powers of q. If the power of q is of the form j times 3j plus 1 over 2, then the coefficient is, you know, -1 to the j. So, it is plus or minus 1, and for all other numbers which are not of this form, the coefficient, that term does not occur. So, the coefficient is 0. So, observe for example that 6 is not of this form, right. So, the numbers of this form, if you put j is 1, you would get 1 times 4 over 2. So, that is 2. If j is 2, you would get, let us see, 2 times 7 over 2, so that is 7. Okay. So, sort of a monotonic function. So, after 2 you have 7, and again when you put j is negative numbers, you will still get something. If j is -2, you will get 5. Okay. So, it turns out that 6 is missed in this list, and therefore, the coefficient of 6 in this expansion is 0. So, observe again that, you know, granting this identity, you have a combinatorial interpretation which says for, you know, the number of partitions, this function, the number of, you know, partitions of n into even minus those into odd, this number is -1 to the j if j is of the form. So, here is a corollary to Euler's theorem. It says this difference is one of the following, it is -1 to the j if the number n is of the form j times 3j plus 1 over 2 and 0 otherwise. Okay. So, you know, for most numbers n, these two things balance each other out, like for 6, but then there are these exceptions. For all these fellows, it turns out that you either have one more or one less of the evens in comparison to the odds. Okay. So, that is the Euler's so called pentagonal number theorem, because numbers of this kind are called the pentagonal numbers, generalize the usual triangular numbers, square numbers and so on. And I will just sort of briefly mention that, you know, so Euler, there are several proofs. Euler himself gave one, and there are several afterwards, but there is a purely combinatorial proof which just uses, you know, this interpretation of the coefficients. So, it is a natural question to ask if one can just prove that identity directly. You take a number n, you partition it into even parts, partition it into odd parts, count the numbers, subtract, and check if you do get this. Okay. So, it turns out, sort of as an aside, there is a purely combinatorial proof which I will just quickly sketch. Proof of this identity, which was given by Franklin sometime in the, so this is Franklin 1880s, which just says the following. So, after all, the observation here is that they are roughly balanced, right. So, we will try and define the following, we will try and define an involution. So, given a partition of a number into an even number of parts, we will try and, you know, associate to it, we will try and form a one-to-one correspondence between these two sets. We will try and construct a bijection between these two sets, and we will see where we fail. Okay. So, we will fail, there will be one fellow extra in one set or the other. That is the rough idea. And so, this is the usual combinatorial trick of constructing an involution. So, if you, for example, if you say let S n denote all partitions into distinct parts, all partitions of n into distinct parts, the idea is to define an involution on Sn. So, what we will try and do is to define a map sigma, so which is an involution. It means you apply it twice, you will get back to the original thing, and which sort of changes the parity of the number of parts. So, it is a parity reversing involution. So, parity of the number of parts reverses. Okay, so that is the rough idea of Franklin's proof, and here is what you do. So, given a partition of a number, So let's imagine you have some partition phi of a number n, and sort of one often denotes partitions by this so-called dot diagram or Ferrell's diagram. So imagine you have this, I need it into distinct parts. Okay, so maybe we just add a couple of more. So let's say this is a partition. So let's see, it's 3, 6, 7 plus 6 plus 5 plus 2 plus 1. Okay, this is a partition which is 7 plus 6 plus 5 plus 2 plus 1. That's 8, 14, 21. It's a partition of the number 21. Okay, into distinct parts, and it has how many parts? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parts. Okay, so here's the involution or the rough idea. You sort of take this graph and think about. Okay, maybe I'll do the following. Let me get rid of this last one. Think of 2, so it's 20. So you define these two aspects of the graph. So first there is this last row, which is called the base of the graph, and then there is this largest consecutive string along the right boundary of the graph. So you start from the top and you sort of keep going one to the left and one below. So it's distinct. So there is, there may not be a dot here. It might be, to the left, in which case you stop right at this, at number 1. So you draw this 45-degree line as far as it would go. For example, I didn't extend it down. I stopped where, there was nothing below there. So I stopped right there. So this is called the slope of the graph. So you have a slope and a base, and sort of this Franklin's idea is the following. You define this map as follows. You compare these two things. If the base is smaller than the slope, like this only has 2 dots, that's got 3, you slide this over there. So for example, in this case, this is the new partition you would form. You would delete this last row, and instead you would slide it up. So that now forms the partition. So it made it 8, 7. The remaining stay the same, 5, 2. No, correct. That's the whole point. So you've changed the number of parts, right? The original thing had one extra part, the last row. Now that part is gone. Instead, its dots have sort of amalgamated with the first 2 parts. So now therefore you have changed the parity of the number of parts. So this is what you would do if the base is smaller than the slope. Now if it were the other way around, if the slope is smaller than the base, you just slide it in the opposite direction. Okay. So for example, if we take this resulting partition, this is 8 plus 7 plus 5, clearly the base is 5 and the slope is 2. So you slide it backwards. Okay. You push the slope back down and make it a base. So therefore you will now increase the part. So it's clearly an involution if you define it in this way. Okay. Whichever way you do it, so you're sort of generating an involution. So of course that seems like, we have proved that the number of this number is 0 for all n, because we have sort of constructed a bijection between things of this kind and things of this kind, right? Not quite, because there are situations where you cannot quite do this. Okay. When does this fail? It fails exactly in 2 situations. Okay. So let's see when this procedure would fail. For example, if say let's take this one. Okay. So the base and the slope sort of meet at that extremity. Okay. So let's look at a partition like this. So here the base is 4 and the slope is 3. So you would have to move the slope down. So by the way, if they are equal, the base is the thing which moves up, okay, not the slope, because remember we have to construct something with distinct parts. The slope and the base are equal and you move the slope down, then there will be 2 equal parts in the end. Okay, you break ties by moving the base up. So now here, if the slope and the base are equal, you are in trouble, because, well, what would happen now? We are supposed to move this down, but the fact is this dot belongs to the slope, and when you move it down, you would create a partition with 3 dots. Right? And the one above, you have sort of eaten up that dot. So it's actually a partition not into distinct parts. Okay? So this is one configuration where it fails. So this here you cannot define this map on this kind of partition. And the other kind is when, let's see, when there are, so here this was more than that, if there are an equal number of dots. If there are an equal number, meaning say I had this. So if I had this partition, so here again this guy is 4 and this is a 4. Okay, so now I cannot move the base up, right? Technically I would attempt to move the base up, but I cannot move it up, because if I do, then there will be one hanging dot at the end. Okay. So it turns out there are two configurations where you cannot you cannot really define this bijection. And if you sort of see what is this configuration, how many dots are there in this configuration. So if you imagine the last row had j dots, then the row after that on top of it would have j plus 1 dots and so on, and there are totally 2j. For example, if this and this are equal, there are exactly j rows. Okay. So this is j plus j minus 1, so that is 2j minus 1. This would be the total number of dots in the diagram, and you sort of use this thing for arithmetic progression. It is the first plus last, which is 3j minus 1 times number of terms over 2. Okay. Or so that was one configuration. The other configuration is if when there are only j minus 1 rows. Okay. So you would probably stop at 2j minus 2. So you would get, these are the numbers for which this involution cannot be defined on one exceptional diagram. But notice this is exactly the kind of thing that is there. You just have to change j to minus j. Is that right? No, I shouldn't get 3j. No, if I change j to minus j, then what do I get? That is right? I get minus j into minus 3j plus 1, that is j into 3j minus 1. So instead of, remember j is supposed to run over all integers. So if I put minus j, then that is exactly that. Okay. So that is roughly the idea. You just got to put it down properly. So anyway, that is the combinatorial proof. And so in some sense this identity has some nice consequence overall, or in fact even a proof using that idea. Okay. So now so I will just mention the second important identity. It has the same sum equals product form. It is called the Jacobi triple product identity. And this again was sort of proved by Jacobi sometime in the 1830s. And it's again a sum equals product identity, except it's got two variables. Okay, so here's the identity. It says the product n equals 1 to infinity. So triple product. So it's in fact it's got 3 terms in each product. That's the reason it's called that. 1 minus q to the n. The other variable is called z. Got a slightly funny form. So there are 3 terms in each product, 1 minus q to the n, 1 minus q to the n z inverse, and 1 minus q to the n minus 1 z. Okay. So you should think of this as being, if you sort of expand this out, what you will get will be a power series in the variable q, but whose coefficients are not complex numbers, but rather Laurent polynomials in z. So each coefficient of a power of q will have some powers of z and some powers of z inverse, but only finitely many. So it's a Laurent polynomial in z and z inverse. So you should think of it as living in that space, and the Jacobi triple product identity tells you what this is when expanded out as a sum. It says this is nothing but the sum overall, let me get this right, n belonging to z. Again, sort of like the earlier identity, minus 1 to the n, z to the n, q to the n times n minus 1 over 2. So again it sort of says only for numbers of the form n into n minus 1 over 2, those are in fact the triangular numbers, right. So, only for those guys will you actually get a non-zero coefficient, and in fact the coefficient is this -1 to the n, z to the n. Okay. And again n is supposed to range over all integers, not just over the positive integers. So, and again Jacobi, I mean the proofs of these things are often through just considering those functions and trying to get recurrence relations and so on. So, sort of elementary, I mean not necessarily easy, but elementary ideas are used to prove many of these things. So, so here's the first observation I want to make, that the Jacobi triple product identity actually implies Euler. So, quick observations. Observe fact 1, you take the Jacobi triple product identity, you do the following: instead of q, so let us do the following, let us change q to q cubed in this identity here, and then instead of z you put q. Okay. So, that is a substitution I am going to make. So, this becomes q to the 3n, q to the 3n, q to the 3n. Z inverse will make it q to the 3n minus 1 in the second term, and the z will make it, well, this is 3n minus 3 and plus 1. So, that is 3n minus 2. So, if you sort of look at the first 3 terms, this is q to the 3n, 3n minus 1, 3n minus 2 over all n's 1 to infinity. That is just the same as running over all the integers. So, that is the same as the left hand side of Euler's identity. Okay. And if you sort of see what happens to the right hand side, I will not write it down, but instead of q I have to put q cubed. So, that is already 3n into n minus 1 over 2, and then I need to add q to the n to that. And if you do that and you sort of just do the algebra, you will see it exactly boils down to this. Okay. So, observe doing this substitution to the Jacobi triple product implies Euler's identity. Okay. So, that is for example one proof of the Euler identity if you assume Jacobi. And number 2, in fact you can sort of do the following, let us substitute, well, do not do anything to q, just keep q as q, and let us put z equals 1. Okay. I want to do this calculation in full because it is going to be a prototype, sort of the simplest example of the Macdonald eta function identity. Okay. So, this is a calculation I want to do properly. So, let us see what do you get if you put z equals 1 into the Jacobi triple product. It is as good as forgetting about z, because I have I can just erase the z's from both sides, right, and I just erase the z there. So, I should get something which deals with 1 minus q to the n, 1 minus q to the n, 1 minus q to the n minus 1, except there is a slight problem. I can't really put z equals 1. So, where will I run into problem? N equals 0, I mean n equals 1 makes this term 1 minus z. So, in fact, if you think about it, there is a 1 minus z occurring on the left hand side. Okay. So, we need to get rid of that. So, I should really say I want to sort of let z tend to 1. I mean this is my goal, I want to put z equals 1, but I can't do it the way it is. So, let us do the following, let us divide the left hand side of the Jacobi identity by the 1 minus z term. Okay. So, we will divide it by, no, I am attempting to put z equals 1, it will become 0, right, it will not give me anything interesting. You are right, it is not a problem as such. I want to put z equals 1, but I want to get something interesting also. So, I do not want 0 equals 0. Right. If you put z equals 1 on the other side, you will probably also get a 0. Yeah, because see q to the n into n minus 1 by 2 and minus, when you substitute minus n minus 1, that is the same term, but with opposite parity. So, you will actually get 0 when you also put z equals 1 on the right hand side. So, I do not want that, I want something interesting. So, let me divide out by that 1 minus z, and therefore, and then, well, I want to do that and then put z equals 1. So, then let me say I want to do this, I want to substitute z equals 1. Okay. So, maybe I should not, I mean I am not doing any analysis here, I am sort of taking the resulting power series and then substituting z equals 1 afterwards. Okay. So, at least the left hand side is now clear. If once I do this, what do I get on the left hand side? So, the left hand side is just this product now, it is 1 minus q to the n cubed, because that offending term is gone and now everything else is just 1 minus q to the n, right. Is that clear? Fine, because I mean the last term is lagging by 1, but when I take an infinite product I will just get that back. It is 1 minus, for example, n is 1, it is 1 minus q, this term is in there, and n is 2, it is 1 minus q square, 1 minus q square, and then this will be the 1 minus q, correct. So, that makes up for that extra 1 minus q, and so one term lags a little bit, lags by 1, but eventually as an infinite product it is just the same thing. So, that is exactly what I get, and observe this is just that Euler phi function cubed. Okay. So, here is it is an infinite product, it is actually a cube of the Euler's function, and let us see what you get on the right hand side. So, I must do these two things, first divide by 1 minus z. So, therefore, to get a new identity here I need to do this, do right hand side over 1 minus z, and then in the resulting expression I must substitute z equals 1. So, this now becomes the following. So, observe I can do the following, I can write this as, so I will do a few things, think of it as n belonging to z minus 1 to the n, z to the n, q to the n times n minus 1 over 2. But observe, I can also think of this as, I am going to change variables, I am going to call m as minus n minus 1. So, or let me change variables now. Okay. So, I am going to take this sum upstairs, but then think of n as minus m minus 1, okay, and you will see in a minute why I am doing this. So, m still runs over the integers, albeit in a different order. So, this is my substitution. So, let me put that in there. It becomes minus 1 to the minus m minus 1, z to the minus m minus 1, q raised to the, what happens to the power of q? I still have it. You are right, I still have it. I am just wondering, maybe I need minus m plus 1. So, let me try minus m plus 1 now. Okay. So, let us see what happens to the power of q, that is the part I am most interested in. So, instead of n, I am going to put minus m plus 1, this is now minus m plus 1 minus 1. So, it has become m times m minus 1 over 2. Okay. So, I am getting the same thing, which is why I am doing this. Okay. So, that is the correct substitution, minus m plus 1. So, now I have the same thing can be written in these two different ways, right, and now I am doing this to get it to a form where I can divide by the 1 minus z. So, the right hand side can be written in one of these two ways. So, now again we can change the m back to an n, right. So, observe this is now a further negative sign. So, let me also do the following. I am going to get rid of this 1, put a negative there. Okay. So, these two things are equal. So, I will just also write the right hand side in a third equivalent fashion, which is half the sum of these two equal things. Okay. So, I have just written the right hand side in two different ways. I am going to think of it as half the sum of these two things. So, it is now n z minus 1 to the n, the power of q is the same. So, here I have silently changed the m to an n. So, it is q to the n times n minus 1 over 2, and now it is z to the n on top, z to the minus n plus 1 on the bottom. Okay, so I have just manipulated this so that I can now divide by the 1 minus z. That's the reason I did all this, of course. Okay, so let's divide now. So this is an equivalent expression, and I can now divide by the 1 minus z. So I divide this by 1 minus z. Okay, fine so far. Okay, so now is the question. So of course, so all this while all I have done is really write down various series and manipulate them and so on. But now is when I'll utter the word Lie algebra for the first time. So let's look at this expression here. Okay. Now where have you seen this before? What is z to the n minus z to the minus n plus 1 over 1 minus z? I mean, what does it look like? For example, if you even figure out what this gives. Character what? SL2, right? It's sort of the character of an SL2 representation, because in fact if you write this out, what is it? It's let's see, how should one do this? Let's pull out z to the, this is the de Mazur operator for SL2, right? What Chandamani in fact wrote out. Okay, so this is actually the character for the SL2 module whose highest weight I think is n, right? Let's think. So what? Okay, I guess my question is, what do you get when you write this out in powers of z? Okay, let's attempt to do that. So when I have z to the n minus z to the minus n plus 1 over 1 minus z, what is it in powers of z? So we should probably pull the z out, z to the n out. So this is z to the n, 1 minus z to the minus 2n plus 1. No, that doesn't look good. Maybe put the minus n out. Okay. Pull the entire power of z inverse out. So let's pull a z to the n minus 1 out. No, minus n plus 1 out, and write this as z to the 2n minus 1. Is that right? Minus 1 over 1 minus z. So let's think of z minus 1 with a minus sign. So it's minus z minus n plus 1. Okay, so this is now 1 plus z plus z square till z to the 2n minus 2, right? And now I'll have to hit it with this again. So this is now going to be okay. So this is now z to the n minus 1 going all the way down to z to the minus great of n minus 1, right? So, okay. So that's in fact the character of an SL2 module whose highest weight is n minus 1, I guess now, right? The n dimensional SL2 module. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. This will be a prototype of the general calculation. But anyway, of course, I was only interested in z equals 1 at this point. So let me now put z equals 1 in the resulting expression, right? So we already know what this is. We computed it. So when you put z equals 1, what should you get? Okay, except it doesn't go in steps of 2. See, that's a slight problem. So we are not really looking at it in steps of 2. So this is more like the SL2 thing for 2n minus 1. So at the moment it's only sort of a resemblance, it's not a precise correspondence. So okay, so when I put z equals 1, what should I get? Let's see, how many terms did I have? 2n minus 1, right? I had 2n minus 1 terms. So therefore when I put z equals 1, this thing becomes 2n minus 1. So here's the final answer. It's half there's also a minus outside, I think. So it's a minus 1 and there's an minus 1 to the n here, and there's an extra minus which comes from here. So it's n plus 1, 2n minus 1, and then q to the n into n minus 1 by 2. Okay, so now we have an identity, I guess. So this is Jacobi's identity for the cube of the Euler function. So here's the theorem of Jacobi. It says take the Euler function 1 minus q to the n product, take its cube, then it turns out to be this infinite sum. So this is again a sum equals product identity. And so instead of, if you, let me just call this n plus 1 as n, so I will sort of make this simpler. So this now becomes, well, n minus 1 I guess. So this is 2n plus 1 becomes q to the, so I am calling n minus 1 as n now. So this is often the form in which you see it. Okay. So here's the theorem, and we have sort of proved it. It's just you need to somehow set z equals 1, but you do it after suitably dividing by the 1 minus z. Okay. So that's Jacobi's theorem for the cube of the Euler function. Okay, so far I've just talked about these two results of Euler and Jacobi. So now I sort of want to mention Ramanujan. Who, well, relevant to this, of course, I mean he's done tons of work relevant to this, but let me just mention a few of these. So here's something about the partition function. So observe, there's also something about, we also have an expression for the reciprocal of the phi, of the Euler phi function. Okay. So this is just 1 over the product of 1 minus q to the n, and if you expand this out as an infinite sum, okay, so you should think of this now as being 1 over the product 1 minus q to the n, which is just 1 plus q to the n plus, so I am just using the geometric series for all n at least 1. So here's an infinite product of each of which is a power series, right, just a geometric series. And now again, like we did in the earlier example of, you know, the number of partitions into distinct parts and so on, if you sort of imagine for a second how would you get a power of say q to the p from this infinite product, I mean the coefficient would just count the number of partitions of that number p, okay, into all possible ways, no restriction on distinctness of parts and so on. So that's called the unrestricted partition function p of n. This is just the number of partitions of n. So example, the number 4 has 5 partitions. So those are the partitions of 4. So you would say that p of 4 is 5. Okay, there are 5 partitions for the number 4. And if you just take the reciprocal of the Euler phi function, it turns out to just give you the generating series for the partition function itself. Okay, so Ramanujan sort of had several conjectures on the partition function, specifically starting sort of with that piece of data I just wrote out. So here are what are called Ramanujan's partition congruences. So this is Ramanujan's partition congruences. And sort of 3 of them, he said the number of partitions of a number of the form 5k plus 4. So the very first example is the number 4 itself. If k is 0, you're looking at the number of partitions of 4, we just saw it was 5. His conjecture was it is always divisible by 5. It's congruent to 0 mod 5. Okay, it's always a multiple of 5. Okay, that's the first congruence. And in fact, the next pieces of data, the number of partitions of 9 turns out to be 30. The number of partitions of 14 is 135, and the number of partitions of 19 is 490. Okay, so at least these 4 values that we can see are obviously multiples of 5. But of course, he didn't quite stop there. (7k plus 5), sorry. So the number of partitions of 5 is 7, for example, but he claimed it was true for all numbers of the form 7k plus 5, and then finally 11k plus 6. Okay. So there are these 3 congruences, and these were only 3 of the several. He had congruences for all kinds of moduli, and he finally formulated all these conjectures by staring at values of the partition function up to n equals 200. Okay. So you compute the values of the partition function till 200, and this was, I think, done by this very famous English combinatorist called Percy McMahon, who was, I think, in fact, a major in the Indian army, served a while in India and so on. So this is sometime in the 1912, I think. And of course, computing values of the partition function is no mean task. It grows really fast. So if anybody who's even tried to write down all the partitions of, I just said, right, partitions of 19, there are 490 partitions of 19. So there's no way McMahon could have possibly written down all the partitions of, the number 200, for example. It would be a really large number. And it turns out he did it using this extremely clever method, which which in some sense we already know, because I already wrote that theorem out. So observe, so this is this extremely clever trick. You know something about the reciprocal of phi q, that's the partition function, but you actually also know something about phi q itself, right? So here's sort of McMahon's trick. Or well, I guess maybe it's a standard trick in the business. So this is the partition function, which is the reciprocal of phi. Now phi itself, we know the formula for. So here's what we know. This is 1, because this is phi, and that's 1 over phi, right? But phi q, we have Euler's pentagonal number theorem. Qj. And now you put this in there, it's 1. Okay, so you look at this, and now what it gives you is actually a recurrence relation. So it tells you the only way this power series times that power series can be 1 is if the partition functions have the following property. Look at the number of partitions of the number n minus j into 3j plus 1 over 2 over all j's in z with some sign is 0. For n at least 1. So if you knew so you sort of built it up in stages. If you know you figure out the number of partitions of n equals maybe 1. I guess that's enough for the induction. And this is there's a recurrence relation which relates the number of partitions of n with the number of partitions of all numbers below n of the form n minus a pentagonal number. And if you know p of n up to n, then of course you can compute p of n plus 1 using this recurrence relation. Okay, so this is the method McMahon used, and of course Ramanujan just stared at those tables and pretty much just wrote all these out. Okay, so these were all just formulated as conjectures, but Ramanujan in fact proved these two things more or less immediately. Well, I'm just going to sketch it very, very briefly. Ramanujan's proof. The first congruence. Well, he said, let's do the following. Again, the Euler phi function makes an appearance. So he starts with this. He starts with this infinite product. It's q times the product of 1 minus q to the n raised to the 4. Okay, it's an infinite product. So again, his proof rests on an identity connecting an infinite product with an infinite sum. But in this case, there's sort of no new information needed. We already know phi q to the 4. We already know certain infinite sum expressions for phi q to the 4. So this is the first step. You split it as phi q to the 1 times phi q cubed, and each of them has an infinite sum expression. The first is Euler, the second is Jacobi. So you just sort of use Euler and Jacobi. This says this is some infinite sum over all j's minus 1 to the j, q to the j times 3j minus 1 over 2. Jacobi, well, the identity we just derived using the Jacobi, so right there on the board, minus 1 to the n, 2n plus 1, q to the n into n plus 1 over 2, probably a half. Okay. So in essence, you've gotten an expression for phi q to the 4, but now there is sort of a new ingredient, which is earlier we wrote, Euler and Jacobi consisted in writing these infinite products as an infinite sum where the sum ranged over z, right, just over the rank 1 lattice. But now the sum is it's really a double sum. So this is now, so this q sort of just comes along for the ride. It's not an important part of the calculation. Maybe I can even get rid of it. This is just to make that phi k plus 4 into phi k plus 5. So let's forget the q. It consisted in n in z, and then this kind of power series. Okay. So again, in a sense, it's this infinite product written as a sum over a rank 2 lattice. Now over all j and n both ranging over z. Okay, over a rank 2 lattice of whatever these powers of q turned out to be. And now, of course, I'm not, well, I guess I shouldn't have advertised it so enthusiastically. I'm not really going to say too much beyond this, but so I mean, in some sense, at this point, I guess it can be made a tutorial problem. But all you have to do now is to expand this out, figure out what powers of q appear. They are the ones which are a sum of a pentagonal number and a triangular number. And then in the end, we are interested in figuring out, in this final expression, you want to see what are the powers of the coefficients of things of the form q to the 5. Okay. So after, let's say, let me put the q back in. You consider this guy, and now you ask, in this resulting thing, what are the coefficients of q to the 5? Okay. And it turns out that that's actually a multiple of 5, and you can determine it by precisely figuring out, just doing some elementary number theory with these numbers and these coefficients and so on. And that you need to do a couple of more things to sort of finally relate it to the partition function. Okay. But it turns out this fellow here is related to the partition function. Well, remember, partition function is 1 over phi to the q. And so this is just, there's also a fifth power here. Okay. So this is a relation between the thing that the Ramanujan starting point and the thing where we want to land up, 1 over phi q. And it turns out that again this fifth power is again enough to give you multiples of 5 and so on. So anyway, I just made very vague noises. Now, but the key point for our purposes is this, that this infinite product turned out to be this double sum over, sum over rank 2 lattice, and sort of the number theoretic properties, the precise coefficients which appear and their divisibility properties was in fact necessary to prove this. Well, at least Ramanujan's proof consisted in using that to prove this congruence. This was the first proof, I think. He himself had subsequent proofs. And it turns out you can also use the exact same proof. Ramanujan used the exact same idea to prove the second congruence, where he now started with, so here's proof of the second congruence. You start with phi q to the 6 instead of phi q to the 4. Okay. So it's again, like I said, it's related to the reciprocal of phi. If you want 1 over phi, then you just make that phi q to the 7. Right. So that it's sort of 1 less than the modulus you want. So you consider this guy, and again his first step consisted in writing this as phi q cubed times phi q cubed and using two Jacobis instead of an Euler and a Jacobi. Okay. So, use the phi q cubed identity that we just wrote out and you use that once more. So, it is again a double sum, it is sum over a rank 2 lattice and you get coefficients. Now, the thing to note in all these things is that the coefficients of q that you get are always quadratic. Okay. So, you get some quadratic in the variable that is being summed over. Okay. And I sort of just mentioned this yesterday as well, that the affine Weyl group sort of, because of that the way it acts, you always end up getting that quadratic factor alpha over 2, and these are sort of manifestations of the same thing. Okay. So that was Ramanujan's proof of the starting point of Ramanujan's proof, the second congruence, modulo 7. But I guess he probably didn't prove the third congruence at that point, and several other proofs were discovered for the third congruence, but nothing which really went along these lines. Okay. So, nothing in which you would try and copy the exact same idea, same starting point and so on. Okay. But there are several other proofs which are sort of more complicated and sort of use other ideas. But sort of it's a natural question to ask if you can pretty much do the same thing for the third congruence and why it doesn't work. And this was sort of remedied by Lasse-Winqvist much later. I guess 69 is when his work appeared. So, he sort of asked the following question: can't one use the same idea to prove the third congruence? Which means you would have to start with following Ramanujan's idea, you would try and do this. You would start with q times phi q to the 10, the 10th power of the Euler phi function, and then attempt to get some kind of try and write it as a double sum, a sum over a rank 2 lattice. And it turned out that he was able to do that. He had to, the reason why it couldn't have been done in this way is you couldn't just use linear combinations of Euler and Jacobi to do it. You sort of really needed a new identity. There was a new component here. There was actually a certain very different identity for the 10th power of the phi function. You could probably have thought of using 3 Jacobis and an Euler and so on, right? But it turns out that doesn't quite help you to do this congruence. So, he had to invent a completely new identity which was based on, so let me just say this was a new identity for this guy. Again, consisted in writing phi q to the 10 as a certain sum, in fact over a rank 2 lattice. So, it is a double sum over I and j in integers, powers of q again being quadratic. And to do this, he sort of in fact did better than just an identity for phi q to the 10. He found instead of a Jacobi triple product, he found what you might call a Jacobi tenfold product. Okay. He found a Jacobi tenfold product identity, which means instead of having just 3 things in the Jacobi triple product, you actually have 10. You actually have 10 terms, and I am just going to write them. So, here is the product side of the Jacobi tenfold identity that Winqvist invented. So, you have 1 minus q to the n. So, remember this also appeared in Jacobi. So, square, okay, there are 2 of them, and the remaining are the Jacobi type terms. So, what did I have? Q to the n z inverse 1 minus q to the n minus 1 z, right. This was exactly, if I only had a 1, this is exactly Jacobi's triple product. These were the 3 terms in the Jacobi triple product. So, now for the moment forget this. So, I am only interested in these terms. So, this was one of his terms. So, 4 terms are accounted for. And now he had a second variable. This is now a thing in 2 variables z and w. Okay. So, I still need 4 more terms, and they turn out to be just the same type of thing, but with certain combinations of Z and W, which is ZW. No, so this is ZW, that's Z inverse W inverse, keeping this intact, and the fourth one is Z over W. So this is 1 minus q to the n inverse of Z over W times 1 minus q to the n minus 1 Z divided by W. Okay, so in some sense you can see it's modeled along the lines of Jacobi's triple product identity, except there is this Jacobi type term for the parameters Z, W, ZW and Z over W. Okay, and then there is this extra term. Okay, and so he sort of wrote this out as a sum, he said over a rank 2 lattice. Okay, and this again, funnily, if you look at his paper, it's very brief. You would imagine such a horrendous looking identity would have a very long proof, but it's sort of a half page proof where it just considers this as a function of Z and W, gets some recurrence relation, and lo and behold, it's done. So it's a very, very quick proof, sort of a very clever proof, I imagine. And it turned out that so like I said, it's a rather elementary proof of this identity. Okay, but the key thing is this, it'll sort of come back. So remember this first part is Jacobi, just Z and Z inverse, and this part here ZW, Z inverse, WW inverse, and these things are this Winquist identity. So maybe sort of at the risk of lessening the suspense, I could ask, is this familiar already in some sense? So where have we seen these 8 things before? Several places, I'm sure, but sort of in our context. So maybe you should, so remember Z and Z inverse. So, in all these character formulas and stuff we are talking about, all these variables are always e to the something. Okay, so the first thing to note is think of Z and W as being e to the something. So if Z is e to the alpha 1, for example, Z inverse would be e to the minus alpha 1, right? If W is a new independent variable, let's call it e to the alpha 2, this is e to the minus alpha 2, right? Okay, so there's alpha 1, this is minus alpha 1. Now there's a second dimension alpha 2, this is minus alpha 2. Now this is alpha 1 plus alpha 2, and that's alpha 1 minus alpha 2, right, together with their negatives. Now where have we seen those? What root system? B2. So this is alpha 2. So it's in fact no, it's the same length as alpha 1. Alpha 1 plus alpha 2 is longer. Okay, so if you think of these in that way, this is just the B2 root system, right? This data here. And Jacobi is just what root system? That's A1, Jacobi's triple product identity. If you think along those lines, if Z is alpha 1, Z inverse is minus alpha 1, right? I mean, of course, at this moment it's rather far-fetched, but anyway, that's what it will turn out to be eventually. This is a tenfold product. No, sorry, what? Jacobi triple product is this A1, because if you look at the terms, you only have 1 minus q to the n. Forgetting this part, of course. These two things would be the Z and the Z inverse. Right? So I'm thinking of them like this. Okay, so the point is, Winquist used this, it had these 10 terms, and now we imagine the same thing that we did, put Z and W equals 1, right? You'll again have the same problem that we had with that Jacobi thing, which is there'll be a funny 1 minus Z and a 1 minus W and so on. Okay, you just divide out by those things, and then you put Z and W equals 1. So if you do that, you will actually get an identity for 1 minus q to the n raised to the 10, right? And now you are all set. Okay, you just use the Winquist identity and you just plug in Ramanujan's proof, it just works without a problem. Every single step is exactly the same. So it proves a third of the Ramanujan congruences. Okay, so in some sense these identities for powers of that Euler phi function seem to have a lot of, certainly a lot of number theoretic content. But I sort of want to mention Ramanujan again. So there's more to this business. So Ramanujan actually defined So here's another infinite product which was first defined by Ramanujan. It's q times 1 minus q to the n, that infinite product raised to the 24. So you can see it's nothing but the Euler phi function, the Euler infinite product phi raised to the 24, which just with a q infinite. Okay, so that's the function f of q, and its coefficients. So if you write this in terms of course, it doesn't have a constant term, but if you see what the coefficients of q to the n are called tau of n. Okay, it's called the Ramanujan tau function. Those values, they're all integers, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, and rather mysterious. But sort of true to Ramanujan style, he just wrote all these things out and quickly followed it up with sort of 2 pages of conjectures on what the tau n should do. So here are various things. So the famous properties of this function, it's multiplicative if n and m are relatively prime. Okay, this is the first property, the tau function. Several others. So let me maybe just write, okay, one more. If p is a prime number, then it's, so this is the modification of this if these two things are not relatively prime. If, for example, they are both powers of the same prime number, then this is for p prime. So it said, oh, this is the property it should satisfy. Congruences, tau of n is congruent to, let's sort of boggle our minds first with the modulus, 691. So he said that tau of n is actually congruent to, this is equally unbelievable. So this is for p prime, sorry. P to the, you mean this here. I think so, yes. It seems very strange though, right? Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. It could be that, because in fact the next congruence, the next relation does involve p to the 11. So maybe it is that, but I'm not 100% sure if I wrote this down right. But, it's correct? Okay, great. And so sigma 11 of n is the sum of all 11th powers of the divisors of n. So sigma 1 of n would be the sum of all the divisors of the number n. Sigma 11 is just all 11th powers of the divisors, you need to sum them up. And tau of n and sigma 11 n are congruent to each other modulo 691. And well, before I state the 4, these two were sort of proved pretty quickly by Mordell, I think around the same time. And the second property especially is sort of related to what are called Hecke operators in the modern language, modular forms and so on. But let me just mention the last one. He said tau of n grows in a certain fashion. It's big O, meaning it's sort of less than or equal to some constant times n power 11 by 2 plus epsilon, where epsilon is any for all epsilon greater than 0. So this is a growth condition. It says tau of n only grows sort of like a power n to the 11 halves. Okay, so this was the fourth conjecture. I guess the first three were proved rather quickly. This turned out to be a very deep conjecture, and it was finally settled, I think, sometime in the 70s by Deligne. So Deligne first apparently showed that this conjecture would follow from the more general and famous Weil conjectures, and which were sort of then proved, I think, by several people, finally by the last remaining bit by Deligne himself. So it turned out that this was somehow tied to all kinds of difficult, well, certainly very hard to see how Ramanujan sort of conjectured this at that point. So anyway, so I guess I mentioned this to say that rather mysterious, mind-boggling object when you take it to the 24th power, but that's where the story gets interesting. So Winquist is in fact I think a German physicist, and sort of interested in what sort of the next person in this history, Freeman Dyson, who is this famous physicist, almost 90 odd years old I think now, currently in the Institute of Advanced Study. He's a British physicist who in fact studied under Hardy I think in the 1940s. So I mean he was interested in physics but also sort of a mathematical physicist. So of course influenced by Hardy in Cambridge and so on, very fascinated with Ramanujan. Of course in fact he had proofs of several of those little results of Ramanujan, his own proofs and so on. So and apparently Winquist sort of corresponded with Dyson when he was working on this, and Dyson figured that he could just use this, like I said, half-page proof of Winquist, those very same ideas, to obtain similar identities, pretty much the same thing. He obtained it for, so remember if you think about what all these identities look like, they are all like this, phi q raised to some power, right? These are identities for various powers of the various powers of the Euler phi infinite product. Dyson found that he could use Winquist's method to extend this to several other d's. So we already have d equals 1 is Euler, d equals 3 is Jacobi, right? We have Euler, Jacobi, we have 10 is Winquist. These are all sort of isolated results at this point, and then Dyson figured he could do it for several other values of d. In particular, he could do it for d equals 24, right, which ties it up with the Ramanujan tau function, because when d is 24, the expansion of this infinite product would actually be, would give you the values of the tau function. So here's the thing for d equals 24 due to Dyson, sort of extending just the simple methods of Winquist. He figured that, so he first obtained such a formula, and then let me just write this down. So it's u1 through u5. So it's now a sum over rank 5. Well, in fact, a rank 4 lattice. Several conditions. So it's set of all integer points, phi tuples set to the 5 whose sum is 0, right? We have seen that before, which satisfies some condition on some quadratic condition, and of course there is this congruence condition of product I less than j ui minus uj. So here's the formula that Dyson found. Okay. Now I am writing it out in full because it's rather beautiful to look at, number one. In fact, so I mean a lot of what I am saying is from taken from various sources, but this whole business is very beautifully described in a certain article, or well, it was actually a speech I think he gave called Missed Opportunities in the Bulletin of the AMS sometime in 72, in which he sort of describes this entire story, and he sort of says he found this formula for tau n which was so beautiful that he couldn't believe that Ramanujan had not found this himself. But well, here's the formula he found, but for our purposes here's the thing, right? This, well, at least this and this are things we have encountered before. This is, what would this be? It's SL5, right? It's if you thought in terms of Lie algebras, then you would say this is somehow related to the Lie algebra SL5, because you remember the root system A4, right, of SL5 consisted of all things of the form epsilon I minus epsilon j, where I not equal to j, I and j running from 1 through 5, right? So this is sort of, there's clearly the A4 root system sitting in here. And if you look at this product here, product ui minus uj over these things, you might remember Sendamarai wrote out this thing called the Weil dimension formula. And if you actually work this out for, so this is over all positive roots of the root system. If you actually take the positive roots of the A4 root system, things of the form epsilon I minus epsilon j, you can sort of see you will get terms like this on the top. And it turns out that the rho alpha is exactly this: 1 factorial, 2 factorial, 3 factorial, 4 factorial is the denominator in the Weil dimension formula. So in some sense, this product over this is sort of something like a dimension of a certain representation of SL4. Okay? So it's clear that there are some root systems sitting in there, but what's rather remarkable, Dyson actually found these formulas for, let's see, 1, 3, 10, 8, just write the entire list. So these already existed. There was 8, 10 is Winquist, there's 14, 15, 21, 24, 26 and several more, okay. And sort of in hindsight, but that's part of his thing there. So what he did is, he just pursued those methods. He found several of these formulas for powers of the phi function, and well, that was it. So he more or less just, I guess, put away his thing, rather happy with having found several of these formulas. And that's where he says that the Dyson, the old-fashioned number theorist, was not talking to Dyson, the physicist, because he says he had seen these numbers several times before in his career as a physicist, because it turns out they are actually the dimensions of the first few simple Lie algebras. Okay, so let's see. This is SL. No, well, 1 is an exception. Let's start with 3. That's SL2. Okay, what's 8? SL3. So let's get the SLs out of the way. This is clearly SL4, right? N square minus 1. This is SL5 that we have just seen. Right? What's 10? We have just said it. It's B2. Well, sort of the root system B2 has 8 roots, and then the Cartan subalgebra is 2-dimensional, right? What does B2 correspond to Lie algebra? SO5, right? B2 is SO5. Okay. In fact, that's also SP4, because B2 and C2 are really the same by way of root system. In fact, there are 2 Lie algebras correspond to that dimension. Okay, what about 21? There's actually more for 15. There's SO6. What's 21? SO7. Right? Remember, these are skew symmetric matrices, so it's n times n minus 1 over 2 is the dimension. So that's SO7, also SP6 if you want. Okay, what's 14? G2. Okay, that's somewhat harder, because of course we never really looked at these exceptional ones, but it's not any of these classical ones. Okay, 14 is an exception, but if you recall the root system G2, it had 12 roots. We didn't look at what the Lie algebra was, but let's only reason with the root system. It had 12 roots, and it was on a 2-dimensional space. The rank of the thing was 2. So if the Lie algebra that it corresponds to, right, and from what Sripad has done, we know there is a Lie algebra that corresponds to the root system G2 by the generators and relations procedure. The Cartan subalgebra of that would be 2-dimensional, because as the rank of the Lie algebra, there are 12 roots. So there are, each of those root spaces is 1-dimensional. So it's a 14-dimensional Lie algebra, whatever it is. We may not understand it too well, but there is one. So that's in fact this case. Okay. So so Dyson sort of says that, like he says, Dyson, the old-fashioned number theorist, was not quite talking to Dyson, the physicist, and he never really recognized these numbers as, having anything to do with Lie algebras. Though this seems to be, I guess he sort of also missed that. So anyway, so that's sort of where it stood. But so in his, this makes for wonderful reading. He says that in the end it had a happy ending, which is sort of unknown to him around the same time. MacDonald sort of cleaned this whole thing up. So here's the right, okay, what is 26? Let's see, F4 would be, no, F4 would be 24 plus 4, right, 28. No, F4 would be more. So, okay, so question, what is 26? By some accounts, it's the answer to all the mysteries of the universe in some sense. String theory says it operates in, we are in dimension 26 apparently. But anyway, no, that apart, it's an exception. It's not one of these guys. And this was sort of an identity due to Atkin, which doesn't fit part of this Lie algebra thing. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So 26 alone is an exception. There is an identity known for D equals 26, which is not explained by the MacDonald theory. Okay, so that's the exception. Okay, so finally, what did MacDonald really do? Well, he sort of just used for every Lie algebra. So to each finite dimensional simple Lie algebra, let's call it G naught, let's say of dimension D. Okay, so what did he do? He associated, well, he showed that there exists an identity of the form equals a sum over M, which is a rank L lattice, where L is sort of the dimension of the Cartan subalgebra, finite dimensional of dimension D, and let me say that and rank L, meaning to say dimension of the Cartan subalgebra is L. So observe for Winquist, it was a rank 2 lattice you are summing over because it's B2, and in the case of SL4 you are summing over the root lattice. I mean you were summing over the lattice of rank 4. So that was the Dyson identity. So this is the sort of identity that was discovered, and I'll sort of say more about the proof next time. But the eta function, so that's just the last remark on what the eta function is. Now it's more or less the same piece of information here, but except so the eta function is defined as follows. You can think of it either as a function of q or tau, but you remember Ramanujan's product, the 24th power of the phi function had a q in front. So the Dedekind's eta function, this is called Dedekind's eta function, is defined like this. So you can think of it as the 24th root in some sense as of Ramanujan's function, but often we write it in terms of tau, where as before when I mentioned in the beginning, q is e to the 2 pi I tau. So this is now e to the I pi tau over 12 times the product 1 minus e to the 2 pi I n tau So again, you can sort of think of this analytically. You can think of this function as a function of the variable tau in the upper half plane, and again by the usual things you must prove it converges and stuff like that. So this infinite product does converge. Think of it analytically. It defines a function on the upper half plane. So it's a complex valued function. So eta is a complex valued function on the upper half plane, and it turns out to be a very important object in number theory. It has, well, it is what's called a modular form. In fact, so is the Ramanujan function. So this is a modular form, okay, which is, well, I won't say too much about it except that the upper half plane has a nice action by the group SL2Z, as sort of analytic automorphisms, and this function behaves in a certain fashion under those automorphisms. When you transform the upper half plane by that group, eta transforms in a certain fashion. Okay, so that's what a modular form would mean, of a certain weight. So here it's called a weight half modular form, and so on. And so this is an extremely rich and important part of number theory overall, the whole theory of modular forms. So the eta function is sort of one example, or more accurately what's sometimes called an automorphic form, and so on. But so if you think in terms of the eta function, you could rewrite all these identities. An identity for some power of phi is more or less the same as an identity for that power of eta, because they just differ by some power of q in front. So you can always push the q over to the other side. But what's remarkable is when you sort of do it in terms of the McDonald theory, the eta sort of pops out more naturally. So you would imagine you will get a power series for phi, but it's rather remarkable that 1 by 24, that q to the 1 over 24 also pops out when you do this thing on the right hand side. And so McDonald sort of pushes that to the left and thinks of it as an identity for the power of the eta function. So in the analytic point of view, when you want to think of it as modular forms, it's giving you an identity for a certain power of that modular form eta. Right? So that's basically where we are headed. And so next time I will sort of say more about the proof. The main ingredients are all we sort of already have all the ingredients. So the basic idea itself is just to use what we call the Weil character formula. Instead of we don't need the most general Weil character formula. We will only need to apply it in the case of a trivial module. You just take the trivial module, the one-dimensional module on which the affine Lie algebra acts trivially. That's the simplest possible case. But when you apply the Weil character formula there, it tells you that the numerator and denominator of the Weil character formula are equal. The numerator is a sum, the denominator is a product, and that's exactly the identity that it translates into. The sum equals product identity. Okay, so we'll just have to unravel the various pieces. So that's next time.